Order.
O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for the peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen. Amen.
Good afternoon, members. Minister statements. Minister Gwetlan Goodanian, the Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, the Government of Northwest Territories made a mandate commitment during this Legislative Assembly to continue to develop and advance initiatives to displace diesel generation in the Northwest Territories, including advancing the Tulsa Hydroelectricity Expansion Project. With the Department of Infrastructure to helm, the Government of Northwest Territories has continued to work with the federal and Indigenous governments, provinces, territories, and Northwest Territories residents to promote a cleaner, more reliable energy supply in rural and remote communities, reducing pollution in Canada's north and creating new opportunities for social and economic development. Mr. Speaker, last month the Honourable Dominique LeBlanc, Minister of Intergovernmental and Northern Affairs and Internal Trade, joined the Premier and myself to announce over $1.2 million in federal and territorial investment in the Tulsa Hydroelectricity Expansion Project. This funding will advance technical aspects of the project and help support our Indigenous partners to develop a business framework for their participation and opportunities the future expansion will bring. This announcement demonstrates the Government of Northwest Territories' ongoing efforts to work with the Government of Canada to realize our long-term vision and approach to energy and climate change, and we will enable the Northwest Territories to transition to a strong, healthy economy that is less dependent on fossil fuels. It also supports our goals outlined under the 2030 Energy Strategy and is part of the full-service infrastructure corridor that will provide clean energy to a region rich in materials required for low-carbon technologies such as cobalt, lithium, and nickel. The proposed initial expansion of the Tulsa project will deliver 60 megawatts of clean energy to the North Slave hydroelectric system, more than doubling the current hydroelectricity capacity in the territory, while improving energy security and stabilizing the cost of energy for all N.W.T residents. This project will also contribute to a cleaner environment and a stronger economy, as it will remove up to 240,000 tons of polluting emissions from the air each year, stimulate local economies and provide employment opportunities for Indigenous and Northern residents. Later phases of the expansion will connect the Tulsa hydroelectric system with the provincial electricity networks, creating a more integrated energy system that will allow for increased north-south energy trade. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned earlier, this federal support will help advance the Tulsa hydroelectricity expansion project in two key areas. First, the funding provided will advance the technical aspects of the project, such as ensuring all previous engineering and design work is up to date, environmental baseline work is completed, and an engagement strategy for all affected people is developed, and a business model framework is established. Second, it will support our partners from the Acknowledgments Territory Government, the Northwest Territories Métis Nation, and the Salt River First Nation to establish their business model frameworks to actively participate in the development of the project. Partnering with Indigenous government is an integral component of this project, incorporating Indigenous rights, knowledge, and cultural values into project design and implementation, and that all stakeholders experience its far-reaching benefits. The Government of Northwest Territories will continue to engage directly with communities and Indigenous organizations on this project to ensure their participation, partnership, and empowerment. Mr. Speaker, this funding announcement is just one step in realizing the full Tulsa project. In addition to the announcement funding, the Government of Northwest Territories has also put in a request with the Government of Canada for additional financial support to further advance the project over the next 3 years. We are hopeful that we'll have a response back from that ask in the coming months. The Tolson Hydroelectricity Expansion Project is more than a transmission project. It represents a key element of the Government of Northwest Territories' vision for a low-carbon economy that will increase the availability of clean, renewable energy to help us achieve our mandate commitment of displacing diesel generation, as well as lowering the cost of living for residents and allowing the Territory to meet its commitments to address climate change. This project also reflects the important role clean energy infrastructure plays in growing and stimulating the economy. Mr. Speaker, this is an exciting time, and we are looking forward to working together with all our partners in this project to realize our vision for clean energy for our communities and our economy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister statements. Minister Ike Gooddan and the Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to update members on our government's recent work on cannabis public education and community health engagement. Northerners have told us that they want more evidence-based, culturally relevant information on health effects of cannabis. In response to that call, the Department of Health and Social Services has been working in partnership with other departments and agencies, as well as the federal government, to ensure that N.W.T residents have access to the information and resources that they need in order to make informed choices. When it comes to considering cannabis use, there are very real health considerations and risks, especially for youth, pregnant and breastfeeding women, and those who experience struggles with mental health. To make sure residents have this information, public education efforts are underway in communities throughout our territory and will continue over the coming years. Since January 2018, the Government Working Group has been working together on potential public education and awareness initiatives. The initial phase of the N.W.T's Cannabis Awareness Campaign was launched in April 2018 and included web content, a direct mailer to all households and businesses, parent talk kits, social media advertising, and in-school education events. Using traditional and modern forms of advertising, we've been able to bring this information to people throughout the Northwest Territories. Educational events have been delivered in schools and to our frontline health and social services professionals. Part of this work included having our Chief Public Health Officer present a question and answer session to Indigenous governments. We've also hosted expert seminars bringing national experts to share new research and information on brain development, stigmatizing language, pregnancy and fetal development, and more. These learning opportunities have given our healthcare providers the chance to explore these topics in depth and learn about best practices being used around the country and the world. Mr. Speaker, just a few weeks ago, thanks to support of the Federal Health Minister, Jeanette Petitpas-Taylor, and our Member of Parliament, Michael McLeod, Health Canada made an investment of $1.8 million to support community-based cannabis public education here in the Northwest Territories. This funding will support our approach for harm reduction model for cannabis that builds off Canada's low-risk guidelines for cannabis use developed by the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. Our harm reduction approach and community-based outreach plans to allow us to engage residents in a dialogue about the realistic impacts of cannabis and other substances. Our goal is to provide factual information that won't glamorize or install fear, but will educate youth, elders, and families about substance use, allowing them to make informed choices for a healthy lifestyle. Recently, I unveiled an exciting new augmented reality poster series as part of this campaign, designed by Northern artist Cody Fennell with input from youth and elders across the Northwest Territories. These posters are generating discussion, but their effect is clear. This new approach to messaging has a significant impact on how young people and their communities are reacting to and engaging with cannabis education. As our public education campaign continues, we'll be expanding efforts in our communities. This will include an arts-based workshop series in partnership with the Northwest Territories Association of Communities that gives communities the opportunity to explore what substance use and abuse look like to them, what resources they have, and their unique perspectives on health and wellness. These workshops will be adjustable for communities so they may create local content that focus on their distinct needs and realities. Mr. Speaker, we are committed to providing accurate and up-to-date information about cannabis to our residents, in particular our youth and other people in higher risk demographics, in ways that resonate with them. We have heard that when it comes to meeting this commitment, that our residents want cannabis information from government that is interactive, honest, and balanced. We will continue to work with Northerners as we roll out the next phase of our cannabis public awareness and information campaign as it makes its way to every community in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Cam Lake.
Mr. Speaker, the public is clearly confused over the situation of binding arbitration. It seems that some in this cabinet are unaware of how a strike will affect Northerners. It seems that some believe that everyday people should just get a loan to make ends meet, or just tighten their belts and cut back on their luxurious spending. These ideas are sadly out of touch with the concerns and realities of everyday people and businesses alike. I've heard just in the last few days from so many concerned constituents, nurses, civil servants, business owners, and students, to name a few. Students of Aurora College have informed me that if the strike goes through, they'll be unable to complete their schooling in time to get back to their regular jobs, being left with incomplete credentials while still being saddled with the costs and debts of having attended courses and programs. There are countless more stories, but I do not have time to go through all of them here today. The Minister of Finance understandably worries about binding arbitration setting a dangerous precedent. Yet the UNW has publicly stated this would be a one-time, non-precedent setting offer. I urge the members of this House to consider these words carefully. Mr. Speaker, to quote the words of the Honourable Premier, if you don't like the process, change it. Well, Mr. Speaker, I believe our constituents have heard this message loud and clear. They have heard ministers say, we are just following the process. They have read the Premier hasn't been briefed on all the options available. They know that that time in the process is running out, and they know that this process has been going on for years. They know that time is of the essence and are afraid of the consequences of a looming job action. I implore the members of this House to heed the requests of our constituents and to remember that we are serving here at their pleasure. It is not only the union members who want to see change. Students, families, business owners, the list goes on. Our constituents want to see a fair resolution to this dispute. And yesterday, the vast majority of people have made it clear to us that this process is broken, and it's now up to this House to step up to the plate and fix this broken process before the worst happens. Now is the time to act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ikagodan and the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was happy to hear the Minister speak about energy today. Mr. Speaker, for a lifetime in the North, we've practiced just one way to power our thermal communities. Fill up the tank farm with fuel, turn on the massive generator, and let it run and run and run. That fuel costs a lot of money. Transporting it costs even more. And now, Mr. Speaker, there's a generator running full speed ahead, even when its power isn't needed. Across the N.W.T, there are many communities running like that right now as we speak. And diesel is very inefficient. As much as 70% of that burning fuel literally evaporates into thin air. Can you believe only 30% is used for energy? Mr. Speaker, we need a better way. A way that doesn't break the bank, doesn't cost more every year, and won't hurt the planet. Thankfully, Mr. Speaker, there are ideas out there. One Northerner, Jeff Phillip, shared his new idea with our committee last fall. You might know him from his SSI Micro, but his new company, SSI Energy, is promoting new and efficient energy systems. His idea is based on his family's owned assets in Fort Providence that have been operating off-grid for many years. Mr. Speaker, it works like this. Instead of one big generator, hook up a series of small ones. They're easier to ship, easier to install, and easier to maintain. When you need less power, turn one off. If one goes mechanical, you've got backup. With a small network, it's easy to add another energy supply component, solar panels and a wind turbine. Burn less fuel, much cleaner energy. What about the wasted heat? Use heat exchangers to send that heat to homes, schools, businesses, even a community greenhouse. Mr. Speaker, critics say that sun and wind is great, but you can't reliably store the energy. But new super batteries can store more energy. They charge fast and discharge slowly. They can work in the cold and are environmentally sound. They are made of graphene. Now, join all these pieces together with an energy server, and you have a district energy system providing power and heat to neighborhoods, commercial ventures, and entire small communities. Mr. Speaker, environmental factors aside, cost alone dictates that we must get off diesel. If thermal communities can be powered more cheaply, subsidies will not be required. All Northerners will pay less. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, as Jeff says in his presentation, this is not rocket science. All of this technology exists and is being used in other parts of the world. I ask, why not here? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Godan and the member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the gratifying experiences with this position is knowledge on programs and services. And coming from a small community, I can understand the need in designing funding applications for community development. Mr. Speaker, programs or initiatives tailored to our Northern Territory, more specifically education and training, a fundamental process in management career security in our workforce readiness procedures. Mr. Speaker, announced last October are two initiatives. Number one, Indigenous Career Gateway Program. Number two, Indigenous Management Development and Training Program. Mr. Speaker, our youth is our greatest resources. Offering supports to this new and upcoming workforce on enhancing, promoting their skills and abilities, we must encourage succession planning of these two initiatives. Mr. Speaker, as said in the news release, quote, the government of the Northwest Territories was recognized as one of Canada's best diversity employers for the 6th consecutive year, 2018, end quote. Mr. Speaker, allow us to market and advertise employment opportunities through the designed training plans. These plans can then be shared within our schools, regional agencies, and later, Mr. Speaker, I will have questions to the Minister of Finance. Massey.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Godan and the member YELLOWKNIFE Centre.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 2 years ago, the Finance Minister made a commitment to explore a sugary drink tax in the N.W.T. He's now making good on that promise, although the effort looks half-hearted. The discussion paper on the tax was posted on January 22nd. Consultations began 5 days later. And don't look for a news release, there wasn't one. And be prepared to dig around the Department of Finance website to find the online survey. The whole exercise feels less like fulfilling a promise and more like a cynical box-ticking exercise. Here's why this discussion matters. I am going to repeat some of the facts and figures available in the discussion paper on the sugary drink tax. 39% of N.W.T. residents are obese, and sugar-sweetened beverages are the single largest dietary source of sugar in the form of pop, iced tea, iced coffee, and energy drinks. They have no nutritional value, none at all. Children who experience high levels of tooth decay would benefit from a sugary drink tax. A tax would also reduce obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. In other words, it would do us the world of good. The challenge in this discussion is to find evidence that sugar taxes reduce consumption. The issue has not been well studied. There is some concern that a sugar tax would steer people into spending their money on other unhealthy food that isn't taxed. A sugary drinks tax would be an experiment to encourage people to reduce consumption. Economists estimate that consumption will drop between 8 and 10% for every 10% increase in price. This proposal is not about generating revenue for government, or at least it isn't in my mind. If there was no change in consumption, the tax would generate $2.6 million. But revenues would shrink if consumption fell, and that would be good. Businesses that sell sugary drinks would have more paperwork to do, as retailers do now who sell cigarettes. The anticipated benefit of the tax is improved health for residents and decreased healthcare costs. The government has already acknowledged the harm inflicted by sugary drinks with its Drop the Pop campaign. Drop the Pop would be more robust if there was a financial reason to reduce consumption. I believe more good than harm is possible from the introduction of a sugary drinks tax. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. On December 6, 2018, changes were announced to the Diamond Policy Framework. The framework was established in 1999. It was intended to foster a secondary diamond manufacturing industry and provide local employment. It has obviously not succeeded, and I have to wonder whether this new approach is going to be much better. The new policy allows manufacturers to export a portion of their N.W.T. rough diamonds in exchange for other investments in the N.W.T. economy, such as jewelry manufacturing, retail outlets, tourism partnerships, and other related endeavors. The hope is that approved N.W.T. diamond manufacturers will cut and polish higher quality rough in Yellowknife while exporting a portion to lower cost places such as India. N.W.T. manufacturers will have access to 10% of the roughly $1.5 to $2 billion worth of diamonds that flow out of the Northwest Territories each year. Manufacturers will need to provide and get approval for business plans that meet G&WT's investment requirements. A review was done to lead to this new approach. The review was done by Constell Group, an international consultancy firm. That study has not been made public. The new policy does not include any public reporting and no monitoring framework. The evaluation matrix for determining the investments required for export of diamonds is not on the ITI website, so there is a lack of transparency in how any applications and/or business plans might be reviewed or evaluated. I'm all for development of a secondary diamond industry, but clearly our best way to retain lasting benefits is to secure an adequate share of the $2 billion worth of diamonds flowing out of here each year through a public review of the royalty regime. When our total royalties from all extractive industries are around $15 to $80 million a year, something is definitely not right. And that's what ITI's own consultants have said. In any event, Mr. Speaker, lots of questions for the Minister later today. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member Tuna de Wolade.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I'd like to talk about a subject that I've touched on many times in the House, home care and the N.W.T. Our current situation in the communities, Mr. Speaker, is that seniors, once unable to continue living independently, are moved into long-term care facilities. It is my opinion and the opinion of many people that the vast majority of elders do not want to be in long-term care. Long-term care is costing the G&WT about $140,000 per year per patient. So if an elderly couple was to be forced into long-term care, it would cost a G&WT $280,000 per year. However, if the Housing Corporation was to retrofit their home for $100,000 into a barrier-free unit, and HSS was to provide full home care in their home, it would cost about another $30,000 per senior. There are economies of scale, Mr. Speaker. Each home care worker will have numerous clients, and each client will have various workers. Mr. Speaker, allowing senior to age in place is essential for our history, heritage, and languages, and the benefits include employment positions in home care in our communities. Some further benefits are higher graduation rates, as families with higher incomes are healthier and their kids are more likely to attend school. Another benefit would include house construction jobs. Mr. Speaker, getting back to home care, looking at the whole N.W.T., the Department of Health and Social Services has completed the survey on long-term care. The survey found that over the next few years, the long-term care needs will be 258 beds. It's mind-boggling to think about the cost of constructing and maintaining these facilities. If the government was to help some of the seniors to remain in their homes for an extra 10 years, they would spend a lot less money. including in Yellowknife, by creating good jobs and having happier seniors. And if successful, 40% of the time, the N.W.T would defer spending $140 million. Mr. Speaker, I've completed a quick scan in Fort Resolution, and I believe that there are about 40 seniors over the age of 70. If we were to provide the supports I speak of today, HSS would defer expenditure of $28 million. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statements. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to take this opportunity to thank the good people at Landa Aviation for taking it upon themselves to help reduce Hay River's cost of living by offering affordable, scheduled flights between Hay River and Yellowknife 6 days a week. Prior to May 2018, when Landa Aviation began offering scheduled passenger flights, the cost of a return plane ticket between Hay River and Yellowknife was $1,200. As I stated before in this House, depending on when you booked, you could fly from Yellowknife to Beijing for less than it cost for the 25-minute flight over the Great Slave Lake. That's why when Landa came on the scene, offering return tickets at half the price, there was a lot of excitement. Instead of $1,200, they charged $600. Landa also offered smaller books of tickets so that businesses didn't have to shell out $5,000 a pop to get a deal on flights. I travel back and forth from my home to the capital quite often, so I've had the pleasure of flying with Landa many times over the past 9 months. And I can attest that they always offer great service, have cheerful staff, and have the most comfortable seats in the business. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, Landa recently announced that it would be ending passenger service at the end of next week. It's a great loss to our community, and it's going to be another financial hit to those who have to pay out of pocket to fly between Hay River and Yellowknife, because I have a feeling that the discounted tickets being offered by the competition aren't going to stick around past next week. I don't think that the folks at Landa ever thought that Sched flights were going to be a big moneymaker. I honestly think they did it to help out our community because they're good corporate citizens like many of the small businesses in Hay River. I wish their contribution to Hay River would have been recognized and supported by this government, and that the N.W.T would have opted to fly Landa a little more often. Who knows what could have been if they did. However, with that being said, Mr. Speaker, I want to once again thank everyone over at Landa for the great service they provided, and I'll be seeing them tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ikegodan and the member Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to see the announcement made by the Minister of E&R on the Enhanced Wolf Harvest Incentive Program launched in the North Slave region. Mr. Speaker, wildlife management in Northwest Territories is key to ensuring that residents can continue their ways of life, living on the land and practicing our cultural ways, whether it's out hunting, fishing, or in the sewing circles across the Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, conservation of our ecosystem as a whole is important to ensure that future generations can hunt, trap, and fish the lakes and rivers across the territory and beyond. Mr. Speaker, as an Inuvialuit who grew up hunting and trapping, I see this incentive giving back to the men, women, and youth who continue to keep our culture strong and vibrant across the territory. This helps harvesters with the high cost of living. Mr. Speaker, kudos to the Minister and his team for acting on their behalf. Mr. Speaker, Indigenous and local knowledge across the territory can set a solid foundation to develop conservation policies for all departments of the Government of Northwest Territories as we work in co-management with Indigenous governments on species, environment, and so on. Mr. Speaker, one day I hope we can achieve full authority and control of our ecosystem on our land, in our land claims regions across the territory. This means developing policy together from the ground up to improve upon the coordination and cooperation we see today. I look forward to E&R's Knowledge Agenda Action Plan, Mr. Speaker, and today I will have questions for the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources on extending the Wolf Harvest Incentive Program to all bear and ground herds across the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on June 18, 1947, Tommy Bitsaka was born to Jimmy and Eliza Bitsaka in the Etla area. He passed away in his sleep on January 6, 2019. He was 72 years old. Tommy was one of 13 children. To know Tommy, he was always busy. He enjoyed being outside, fixing, adjusting something, often on his skidoo and boat. He loved his traditional lifestyle, whether it was hauling wood, hunting, or fishing. He loved being outdoors. The family and friends spoke how he was an excellent provider for the family and friends. He was a generous man. Tommy was very selfless, always ready and willing to help out regardless of the situation. Tommy raised 2 daughters, Dorothy and Susan, whom he loved and cherished deeply. As a father often does, he worried about his girls. He raised them to be strong, independent, hardworking. He stressed the important teachings such as generosity, being direct, loving, caring for your family. Those values he held close to his heart. Tommy loved and appreciated his nieces and nephews. They were a very important part of his life. He never wasted a moment to share his knowledge with them. As Tommy got older, it was not uncommon to see him walking with a walking stick. Because he enjoyed being outdoors, so exploring the land around him was part of his daily routine. Tommy was a man of gratitude. He was grateful to the Lord for providing this great country with daily opportunities for him to learn and appreciate it each day. Although Tommy had a serious look about him, he had a great sense of humor. This was evident as you got to know him better. He took each moment as it came and had a light, kind, humorous-filled attitude about his life. His sense of humor, life, and laughter was extremely contagious. Before you knew it, you'd be laughing along with him, which helped Tommy make friends very easily. I had the personal pleasure of chatting with him on a number of times and had to say he was very knowledgeable. He shared stories about the land, his life, and his family. Tommy will be deeply missed and one valuable trait he will always be remembered by is his patience and laughter. Tommy was survived by his 5 brothers, 5 sisters, 2 daughters, 3 grandchildren, 2 great-grandchildren, and numerous nephews and nieces, great-nephews and nieces. The Bitsaka family would like to thank everybody for their loving support, prayers, and donations during this difficult time. Mr. Speaker, Tommy will be sadly missed. Thank you.
Masi, our condolences to the family as well, to the community. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Colleagues, I'd like to draw your attention to visitors in gallery. We have Dolphins in the gallery. I'd like to thank him. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. She came back. I'd like to recognize my constituent and my girlfriend, Ms. Chantel Lafferty. And I'd also like to welcome back again my aunt and my constituent, Ms. June Simpson. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for N.W.T.
Mr. Speaker, earlier on a lady from by the name of Lena Schofield, who was part of the development of the Yellowknife Inuit Kayut Tek'irit, which is an Inuit organization started up in Yellowknife to help Inuit that don't live in their land claims regions with funding so that some kids can play hockey, play soccer, attend sports and things like that. So I just want to welcome Lena if she's still around. And also, Mr. Speaker, my high school buddy, Mr. Dolphus Ntsiza, welcome, and Kuyanani, Mr. Speaker.
Masi, recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Acknowledgments. Acknowledgments. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Okay. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to recognize 2 pages but unfortunately they're somewhere in the building, and I wanted to recognize them from 2 students from Chief Sunrise School, Elora Kayan and Kiera Hikinia Sabrin, and also the chaperone, June Simpson. I'd like to welcome to the House. Masi.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Inuvik Boot Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too would like to recognize a couple of pages that have joined us here today. Corbin and Ava Grace Dempster, thank you for all the work that you've been doing for all members of the Legislative Assembly. I hope you enjoyed your experience and promoting the program to your fellow colleagues back in Inuvik. So welcome and thank you. Thank you, Speaker.
Mussey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Acknowledgments. Acknowledgments. Oral questions. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier I spoke about the wolf harvest incentive program by the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. My questions are for the Minister of ENR. Mr. Speaker, there are harvesters who harvest wolves in the territory, and they, sometimes rather than bringing them to ENR, they would like to sell them to a family member so that they can make crafts and sometimes clothing. And Mr. Speaker, I think what my question is are harvesters who sell their wolves to private members in the community, are they still eligible for the prime fur bonus incentive from ENR? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to be eligible for the prime fur bonus, their fur needs to be sent to the fur auction and it must sell for over $200, and they'd be eligible for the prime fur bonus. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. Oral question, Nakita Dayakasi, member in N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the response. There was a bit of confusion of maybe communications in some regions of the territory for that. Mr. Speaker, that leads to my next question. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister extend the Enhanced Wolf Harvest Incentive Program to the rest of the barren ground caribou herds across the Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the program Wolf Incentive Program is being run as a pilot project this year, this winter, to support the conservation and recovery of the two specific barren ground herds, the Bathurst and Blue Nose East. We heard from our travels around the Cleat-Show a couple of weeks ago that many of the people there and a lot of the elders felt like the caribou were one of the main or they took a fair share of the caribou, and they wanted to know what our plans were trying to deal with that. So this particular program is a pilot program, is aimed at those two specific herds for now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. Oral question, Tada Dayakasi, member in N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the response, and pilot programs like this are definitely a good indicator of what we need to do looking forward, and definitely a good opportunity to look at other herds. Mr. Speaker, grizzly bears and eagles are also contributing factors of decline to caribou herds during the calving season. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister consider co-management with Indigenous groups to better monitor barren ground herds during those fragile times? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely. In my conversations with a lot of the Aboriginal leaders that I've been speaking to, I said the only way this is going to work is if we work with our Aboriginal partners. We have a number of programs that we're trying, but we have been working very closely with them. We are monitoring, trying to monitor the herds. We have a couple of programs that are out. One's boots on the ground. Another community's got moccasins on the ground, I believe. We're looking to expand on those programs, because what we heard in our tour again was the fact that maybe you should send these monitors out 2 times a year, once during the winter, once in the summer, and I thought that was great advice. So we're looking at that. I have directed the department to come up with a plan and come up with identify some sources of funding and where we can access those from. So it is a program that's well received. We had a great presentation on the Boots on the Ground program during the tour that we had. We had some great video footage, actually, and I'm going to see if I could find that video footage and post it somewhere where folks will have access to that footage. I found it, that footage that we watched, I think was very helpful and it kind of demonstrated the value of the monitoring programs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. No data cast member in the N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that response. It looks promising as we move towards co-management, self-government, and our own self-determination. It looks like we have something to work with, and I think this is something that we can improve upon as we move forward. Mr. Speaker, grizzly bears also play a huge role during the calving season, and they definitely the numbers around the communities in Northwest Territories have been rising from reports from harvesters and even community members and bears coming into the communities during the summer and fall season. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is: will the minister look into better incentives for barren ground grizzly bears in the Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the N.W.T, we currently don't have any specific incentives for the harvest of grizzly bears in the N.W.T. Again, we will work with our co-management partners and see if we can come up with some initiatives toward that. If we find that they're a threat, as part of the monitoring program too, we were thinking that they'd be able to monitor the number of grizzly bears that are actually following the caribou. One of the stats that I found quite alarming when we were doing our tour was the fact that I think they followed them in they did the calf count at a certain time of year, and I believe they did a calf count again in the fall, and was down by almost 80%, I believe. So the calf survival rate was very low, and a lot of that, and it showed right on the video where the wolves in the video were actually stalking the caribou, and the end of the footage showed a wolf actually walking away with the calf that it took out of the herd. So we feel that through our enhancing our monitoring programs, we'd probably be able to be a little more assistance to the caribou and try control the predators. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, you could add the member Trinity Willoughby.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I made a member statement on home care. I was going to ask the Minister of Health questions on home care, but the Minister of ITA trumped my member statement, the Tolson statement, so I have questions for him. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister of ITI if during any Indigenous engagement, if he would present the idea of a retrospective environmental assessment from the original project at Tolson. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I clearly laid out in my minister's statement today, the one and two things that we want to do, and one of the first things we need to do is dust off some of that old work that's been previously done with the Indigenous partners that they had at the time, the DESE group. There has to be a significant amount of work that has to be done. The technical aspect of it is as well as the environmental assessment part of this that has to be revitalized. So we're going to be looking at all those things. As I've said, we want to ensure that all the previous engineering design work is up to date and that baseline work is where it needs to be, and engaging with our Indigenous partners that are affected. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Cassie member Trinity Willoughby.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, in case in the DAZE days it hasn't been covered, I'd like to ask the Minister if he is prepared to review all of the processes of approval with the original project back in the 1960s. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't think there's a need for us to go back to the 1960s. I can see where this line of questioning might be going, but you know, back in the day when they built the Tolson project, that was a federal initiative, and they were in charge of land and resources in the Northwest Territories at that time. We have since just passed devolution, and we're moving forward with our legislation to address these things. But I don't think there's a need for us with our Indigenous partners moving this project forward to go back to the 1960s. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadode Cassie member Trinity Willoughby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, maybe a simpler task would be to look at the history of Tolson River and how it related to the people that were living off the land. Would the minister be prepared to have his department look at the history of what happened on the Tolson River prior to the construction of Tolson River Dam? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, we are working with our Indigenous partners. We also had the prior history with the Dese group who also supported this project going forward. I've had engagement with all 3 Indigenous governments on the funding announcement. They're willing to participate in this. We will be going out and engaging communities on these projects and Indigenous organizations to ensure that their participation and partnership is going to help us empower this project, and we will work on that basis going forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Nudere Kasi member Tunade Wolode.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the minister if he would be prepared to share the findings of the Indigenous engagement for the money that was issued from the federal government for that purpose. I'd like to ask the minister if he would commit today to share those findings with the Legislative Assembly. Thank you.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure exactly what the member is asking. We did the federal announcement. Prior to the federal announcement, I gave the Indigenous governments a heads up. In fact, I even flew to Edmonton to meet with 2 of them and have discussions about them supporting this project and how we want to work on this thing going forward. There seems to be a lot of goodwill in the room on this project, and that's why we're moving forward on it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Ikere Canyon, the member YELLOWKNIFE Center.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Finance. In my statement, I spoke about the cynical box-ticking exercise that the Minister has undertaken to engage N.W.T. residents on the question of a sugary drink tax. My question for him is, why is consultation happening now when your only remaining budget has already been tabled? Merci.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, respectful of the process that this Assembly undertakes, we have decided that we are going to go out for a consultation like we normally do when we're presenting these types of new initiatives, get feedback from the public, which we take very seriously, and that will give us an indication of where we need to go moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Akidare Kasi, member YELLOWKNIFE Center.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is why the consultation on this issue is happening now when there are no more budgets to come in this Assembly. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, regardless if there's any budget coming forward or not, we still need to do the consultation because what people out there say is very important to us, budget or no budget session anymore. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadade Kasi, member YELLOWKNIFE Center.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my next question is, what is the end result of this consultation going to look like then? Is it going to be something that is added in a supplementary appropriation? Is it a recommendation to the 19th Assembly? What's the point? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish I knew what the future of this particular consultation would look like. I'll buy lottery tickets for tomorrow. But the work needs to be done. And much like the work with the formula financing a couple of sessions ago, or a couple of assemblies ago, that was going to be quite an undertaking, so the work, it was decided that they would do the work before the end of the assembly to determine exactly what the gap was and how it might be utilized going forward. So that work was done, and I see that as this as well. We'll do the work now. There'll be an opportunity to, if the work is done quick enough, maybe come forward with a request. We don't know that until we hear back from the people of the Northwest Territories. Haven't failed that, then it may be a recommendation to the 19th Assembly. But we won't know until we hear from the people and we can conclude the consultation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere Kasi, member YELLOWKNIFE Center.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my last question is what efforts the minister is going to make to engage residents of the Northwest Territories by giving some profile to this consultation on the Department of Finance website. Merci.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I take the member's point. I will follow up and ensure that this is given the attention that it should be getting. And I do know from being in a couple of places that there was some, well, signs going up in the communities as to consultations that were happening there. I've seen some early indication of some of the consultations that are going on in the community, some of the comments that were coming out. Obviously, they were in the paper. And because you mentioned the word tax, there's everybody all says that, well, I'm opposed to any type of new tax, and so we'll always have comments like that. But this is a consultation. We're very interested in hearing what the public has to say, and then we'll put a plan together going forward. But I take the member's point in response to her question. I will follow up and make sure that this is given the attention that it deserves. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Or question, you could add the member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are going to be for the Minister of Health and Social Services, again in regards to the wellness, regional wellness councils. Mr. Speaker, it's great to hear that the councils move their meetings to various communities in the region, and it's been very helpful. Unfortunately, there seems to be a lack of community awareness of the meetings. Can the minister advise us what the council does to advertise their meetings, and how do they encourage public involvement in these meetings? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will answer the question, but before I do so, I just want to take this opportunity to apologize to the member. Yesterday, he asked me some questions on the Regional Wellness Council and gave me an example, and I responded that I had responded by way of email. It turns out that that email was in my draft account, and I never actually hit send. So I'm embarrassed, and I really apologize for giving that wrong information. And this morning, I did send the member an email with the correct information. So I do apologize for the confusion and the frustration that response yesterday may have caused. When it comes to regional wellness councils, they are required to make sure that the public has timely notice of the date and times of meetings. Advertisement for regional wellness council meetings is usually organized by the regional wellness council through the authority that they're responsible for. So it may look different in every region and community depending on what the best means of getting that information out. I know in some cases it's posters, in some cases they've gone to local radio. There really is no one method for getting that information out. But I do hear that there may be some concerns. I will certainly talk to the department and get them to work with the authority to see if there are better mechanisms to get information out to support our regional wellness councils to make sure that these meetings are well attended. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Or a question that Kidder member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And before I go into my next question, I appreciate the minister for the correction in our communication, and these things happen all the time, so I greatly appreciate him coming to make an announcement here. So my next question is, does the community wellness councils have agendas that have spots to allow public involvement in the meetings? If not, will the minister and the department work with the N.W.T. Health and Social Services and have it as a standard part of their agenda? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Regional Wellness Councils approve their agendas for every meeting, so there's an opportunity to make amendments. Typically, the meetings don't have activities to have like sessions for public input, but that doesn't mean they can't. So if the Regional Wellness Council wants to open the floor to take questions or comments, that is certainly something they could do on a one-off basis. I'm not sure that it would occur on every agenda. It's really up to the Regional Wellness Council. We don't want to be too prescriptive on what they're discussing. We want to hear from them. But having said that, Mr. Speaker, attending the Regional Wellness Council meetings is not the only way to get information. We anticipate and we expect that the Regional Wellness Council members are going to be hearing from their community members, people in their communities, in and outside of those meetings. So there's lots of opportunities for them to get input from their communities and filter it into the system so that we can make good decisions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Or question, member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the Minister for his answer. And yeah, it's important if we're going to be having these meetings in communities that there's some avenue for people to participate in it, and I thank the Minister for that. And so I will be able to share that with my constituents and talk to the regional councils about that. So, and I appreciate that each agenda and each organization have different ways of doing things. My next question is, are stats such as walk-in, medevacs, training and development plans shared with the Regional Wellness Council's members when asked, and if not, why? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my expectation that those will be shared when requested by the Regional Wellness Councils. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I greatly appreciate that answer. And I look forward to working with the regional councils because they've been asking me for that information. So I greatly appreciate the Minister with his answer. My final question is, can the Minister explain why the Council is not able to hold meetings without having a chairperson in attendance? Do they not have a vice chairperson identified when they do this process? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I attended a meeting with the Leadership Council in the spring, and one of the issues that the board members actually brought to my attention was that in our current setup, there was no possibility for deputy chairs of the Regional Wellness Council, which meant it was sometimes difficult to hold meetings. Two things have to happen. There has to be the chair, and there has to be quorum. So at that meeting, Mr. Chair, I actually directed that the Department of Health and Social Services work with the Territorial Authority to amend that so that we can actually have deputy chairs appointed. I also asked the board members to work with the members to select a deputy chair from within their own ranks. And I understand that a number of the regional wellness councils have already identified individuals to be deputy chairs. Others haven't at this point, but they certainly have the authority to select and appoint a deputy chair. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. The member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My question is for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment, and I certainly gave him a heads up about this first question I want to ask him. So can the Minister tell us the maximum annual value of rough diamonds used for manufacturing here in the Northwest Territories, and what that figure is as a percentage of total production in that year? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, first of all, I can't answer the part of his question because it's considered proprietary because there's only one manufacturer. But what I can tell the House is the producers make available 10% of their production by value to the manufacturers. Over the past 8 years, only an average of 0.6% or 10.6 million annually has been used by the manufacturers. So that's one of the reasons you can see why we took this initiative to change this policy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Minister for that. Wow. We're not using very many of those diamonds that are supposed to be made available. So I know that the changes to the diamond policy framework are relatively new, but can the Minister tell us how many approved N.W.T diamond manufacturers there are now, and if any new ones have applied under the new policy framework? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's currently two. We got Elmont Diamonds Limited, who recently was approved as our latest one. Crossworks Manufacturing Limited, who operates uptown. These two are both actually working, updating their business plans to meet our new matrix. But also in response to this news that when we announced this policy, I want to let this House know that these amendments were positively received. We've had preliminary discussions with two more international manufacturers who are interested in setting up here, and additional discussions with diamond brokers and industry experts that represent other manufacturers have also got a hold of the department. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to thank the Minister for that, telling us about the new interest. In my statement earlier today, I said that there's a lack of transparency around this new framework. the evaluation matrix is nowhere to be found on the ITI website, so I hope these two new companies were able to find it somewhere. And there doesn't seem to be any monitoring framework or public reporting under the new framework. So can the minister explain how potential manufacturers can put together an application without knowing how they will be ranked or rated? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The development of the approved diamond manufacturer application process is a lengthy collaborative process. ITI has determined that discussions with the interested manufacturers and brokers are most effective when changes to the DPF are represented in a manner that clearly outlines the department's new amendments and investment requirements. This methodology allows the manufacturer to better understand the environment and the key investment drivers. Following these preliminary discussions, ITI has shared the matrix with others related in information and recent interested parties. But I can also at this time commit that we will post this online. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. N.W.T. Member Frame Lake.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for that really helpful commitment at the end that the matrix that's used to evaluate the proposals is finally going to get posted to the website. Over the last 20 years, our efforts to establish and maintain a viable secondary diamond industry have been a failure. Would the Minister agree that the easiest and best way to retain benefits is to ensure that we collect a fair royalty for the extraction of diamonds and other minerals, and that this will be accomplished, should be accomplished through a public and independent review? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member knows, and I've said it publicly, I've said it in committee, that this government is committed to looking at all the taxes that are around the royalty regime. We've made the decision to put that off to the 19th Legislative Assembly, but that current work, our department, I've directed them, and they've already started to do some of the legwork that's going to have to be needed to be done in the 19th Assembly, so we can have a full comprehensive review of what's all included in this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Infrastructure. Earlier today, the Minister of Infrastructure spoke eloquently about the transformational energy that the Tolston hydro expansion could offer the North. I spoke earlier about a new idea that SSI Energy presented to our committee with regard to a concept for district energy systems that could really be transformational for remote communities on thermal energy. I'd like to ask the Minister, simply, has the Minister seen the presentation? Has he watched the video from SSI Energy to the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, yes, I have. I've actually had the opportunity to meet with Mr. Jeff Phillips and Mr. Cadwell, I believe, and discussed his idea with me at great length here about 2 weeks ago. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nakita member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that's good news. I appreciate that the Minister has seen the presentation and has met with Mr. Phillip. That said, Mr. Phillip publicly stated in the presentation to our committee that his company would supply, fund, and guarantee such a system. I'm wondering if in the Minister's discussions, did they have an opportunity to talk about any potential partnerships to invest in and put in or install this type of a system into any one of our thermal communities as a pilot project even? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, I'd be very curious to see reaction from committee when Mr. Phillips did his presentation. As we all know, he's a very high energetic guy. I call him the Elon Musk of the North with all his, he has a lot of ideas. He's got a lot of stuff going on there. In our discussions, though, with Jeff, you know, there's a few things that he wants to try to accomplish all at once, and I suggested that, you know, we need to piecemeal this a little bit if we're going to even have a look at this thing. I've directed him to, he wanted to know who he needed to talk to within our department, and I directed him to our energy division to sit down and have those discussions with them. One of the things I was a little concerned about was which community he wanted to do it in, and maybe we should have a look at biting off a little smaller piece somewhere else, but he's adamant that he thinks he wants to do it within his community of Fort Providence. But he's been asked to task my department to have those discussions and see if there's anything even possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it sounds a little bit promising. I wonder if the minister, knowing that there are many communities that have these large generators, of which a number of them are scheduled at some point in time in the future here to be replaced, will the minister work with his colleagues, in particular the minister responsible for the Power Corporation, or in his capacity as chair for Ministerial Energy and Climate Change Committee of Cabinet, have a discussion about the opportunity of replacing one of these large generators with this multi-small generator system that is being proposed by SSI Energy? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, that's why I've actually asked Jeff to go talk to our energy division to have a look at what's possible. I'm not saying we're not going to do it. It's the whole idea of our action plan and our 2030 energy strategy is we have a 3-year action plan, and we know technology is going to change significantly over the next 10 years on how we're going to address greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the Northwest Territories. And Jeff has a great idea, and I've asked him to have a serious chat with our department, and when I get the feedback from that, we can seriously have a look if this thing is viable and looking at changing out something in one of these communities if it's going to work. But at present, right now, we're still moving forward with our plan around wind and solar and biomass and LNG and the Tulsan and variable speed generators in different communities, and we will continue to work on that. But I'm not saying we're not against this project. We will certainly have a serious look at it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nudere Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do truly appreciate the intentions that the minister has, and it seems that they're well-meaning and that we're heading in the right direction. The district energy system that was proposed is certainly a game changer unto itself, but a portion of that district energy system consists of these new super batteries made of graphene. These, being used onto themselves, can be used for multiple purposes. The Colville Solar Project, the Nuvik Wind Project, even remote mines. Would the minister make a commitment to at least have the Energy Division look further into the use of these new graphene batteries, because they alone could be used for multiple purposes, not having to change over small communities to a whole new entire system, but just the use of these graphene batteries alone? Will the minister commit to having his Energy Division look a little more into the graphene batteries? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm well aware of these batteries. Jeff actually met with me probably almost a year ago and had a discussion around these things. I think he has become now the actually Canadian supplier for these things. I don't think he's actually sold any quite yet. He's working on a number of initiatives right across the country on what he's trying to do. But we are, yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are having a look at these things that have not been installed anywhere in Canada yet, but we got to have a serious look at how we're going to tackle these battery situations across the Northwest Territories, particularly around the wind and solar aspect of it. Most of these systems need a battery. The member is well right that these things load up and keep power a lot longer. They can't freeze these things, so we have to have a serious look at it, and I've directed our energy department to have a look at it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Canyon, the member South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following up on my questions today, it's for the Minister of Finance on Indigenous Career Gateway Program and the secondary program here, Indigenous Management Development and Training Program as well. My experiences have found that the Satu region, with the government and the agencies, run a workforce of 375 employees. Given that amount, in preparation to readiness and awareness of these programs, can the minister commit to designing and promotion of a brochure for the delivery and awareness of these two programs? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there was a news release that went out in October of 2018 and talked about a couple of new programs to open new career pathways for Indigenous Northerners. And as far as there's brochures to promote that, I'm not quite sure if I've seen any brochures yet, but I could follow up. And I'm sure information is also available on our website with the proper information for those that want to take advantage of these programs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie member Satu.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for that reply here. I find it very encouraging and inspiration on these types of programs here that we see in this institution, and sharing that with the smaller communities would really create awareness of the opportunities that are out there, but they all are subject to fulfilling your education and so on. So it will encourage the youth to visualize themselves in taking over some of these opportunities as the age group of the workforce goes. And my next question is after the developments of this brochure, a campaign profile, can the minister share that with the schools and the DEAs and the other agencies within the Satu and the whole territories for that matter? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the things that we're very proud of in the Northwest Territories is the amount of Aboriginal people in our workforce, Indigenous people. We continue to try and enhance those numbers, and they a lot of value that's brought to the positions, and we continue to promote that. If there's an opportunity in this particular situation to promote these programs that say educational fairs and things like that. I'm not quite sure exactly the details of our department's plans on promoting the program. I will follow up and I will share any information that I can gather with the member and members of the Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Tadade Cassie member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad for that answer here on the issue of promoting these two initiatives. And in doing so, it'll create inspiration to our youth that there is opportunity out there beyond post-secondary classes. Our group is promoting a youth inspirational tour in the Satu sometime this spring, April or May. Can the minister commit to providing some promotional brochures about the program and the criteria and so on, so we can distribute the pamphlets during our Satu tour? Thank you, Mr.
Masi. Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Talent Acquisition and Workforce Planning Unit attended career fairs, and that goes back to the member's first question, and in many different regions. Recently, they attended a Clavik Healthy Living Fair and the Fort Providence Skills for Success Career Fair, and they plan to attend a career fair in Betchico, and it will be attended by all high school. Again, that's an opportunity to promote some of the opportunities, and they recently finalized the guidebook on careers in health and social services profession. The N.W.T. Focus Career Guidebook will be shared with all schools. So any opportunities that our departments have to share information on potential opportunities and training, they will do so at a number of fairs that they attend across the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Hikada Canyon, the member Hay River North.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have some questions for the Minister of Infrastructure regarding his earlier minister's statement about Tulsan hydroelectricity expansion. I recall earlier, or I guess last year, the MLA for Tunaday-Willaday, questioning the government about why they weren't consulting with local Indigenous groups in the Fort Smith area regarding the expansion of Tulsan, and the answer was that there was no customer for the hydropower that could be generated by an expansion, so there was no point in consulting because there was no customer. I see that there's money now for consultations, and I wonder if there is now a customer. My understanding is the plan is to ship the energy north towards presumably the diamond mines, but given that this might not be completed until the mines are all shuttered, I want to know, do we have customers who have signed on the dotted line for this power? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've clearly laid out in my minister's statement today, we had two parts of this. We were going to clearly have a look at the regulatory process, the environmental process, the engineering around this thing, and then Aboriginal participation on it. They need to build a business case in that. That'll be some of the ongoing work that we will be working on. And hopefully in the coming months, as I said in my member's statement, with more federal funding to help us support this, that we'll be able to look at all those aspects. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Akira Cassie member, Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That leads me to my second question. The minister stated that there's an application for more federal funding. I think that in the last assembly, there was about $15 million spent on looking at expanding Tulsan. I know we have another couple million now. So what is this federal ask, and how much of it would have to be GNWT dollars? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, we clearly announced that we had $1.2 million with the federal minister of Northern Affairs, Minister LeBlanc. We don't have an application as such. We're hoping that there's going to be something in the coming months that the federal government will get behind and help support this project. And I would closely probably watch the federal budget to see if there's going to be any extra funding in there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Tada Cassie member, Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I just saw in the minister's statement, it said that the GNWT has put in a request for additional financial support, and so I guess it's on application per se. It's just a request. I know that the minister says that phase 2 is looking at an interprovincial connection, and I've asked in this House before about talks with Saskatchewan. I understood that was one of the customers they were looking at. Have there been any recent talks with Saskatchewan that the minister can update us on? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe that the department has not talked to Saskatchewan lately, as we've changed our refocus on joining the North-South slave grids at the present application. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundida Cassie member, Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My final question is, how do we expect to pay for this expansion? I know that it might pay for itself over time, but the budget just came out yesterday. We're almost right up against the debt wall. Maybe at the beginning of this assembly this was viable, but our borrowing limit is almost maxed out. So how does the minister think that this is going to be paid for? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said, we've got a lot of work to do. We've got to work with our Indigenous partners, do all our preliminary work that needs to be done. So it'd be kind of preempting on how we're going to pay for this if we can't prove out that there's a viable project. But I'm sure the Minister of Finance has been in discussions with his federal counterpart on looking at different ways that we may have to change our borrowing limit on this. But there's different opportunities on financing this project, and that's what we need to scope out. It might be through the Federal Infrastructure Bank, it might be private equity. There's a whole bunch of different business cases that could be presented to finance this type of project. So there's a number of things that need to be done, as I've clearly said, and we will continue to hope that we get some more federal funding to prove this project out. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Yikada Canyon, the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, follow up to my member's statement last year. I have a couple more questions for the minister responsible for infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, it's been almost 2 years now since a windbreak has been taken down from kilometer 4 on the Dempster Highway because it was deteriorating. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the minister, when will the department replace this windbreak at kilometer 4 on the Dempster Highway? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My recollection on Kilometer 4 windbreak was in discussions with the Gwich'in Tribal Council that they asked us to take this down, but I would have to follow up with the department if they've been in any more discussions with the GTC and see if they want us to replace this or what the procedure is going to be moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nakita Cassie member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I recall it, I believe the community of Fort McPherson actually asked to take it down because it was an eyesore, because it was falling apart at the time. You know, it was probably built before we had pressure-treated wood, and you know, will the minister ensure that this work takes place this summer, as it is really affecting the road closures due to high winds? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi, Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can certainly follow up with the department and get them to have a conversation with our superintendent in the region to reach out to the local community and talk to our contractor on that section of the highway to see what's happening on the ground and get back to the member on what our plans are moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Tadade Cassie member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know last year the department was saying that they haven't noticed any more closures than usual, but this year, because we've had more snow, higher winds, we've had this trouble in this spot at Kilometer 4 to be specific. So once the minister finds out from his department that this really is a problem like I'm bringing up, will the minister ensure that they work with the community or the contractor over the summer to ensure this work is done? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi, Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If this does prove out to be a situation that needs to be addressed, depending on what the cost is, I suspect that this is something that we can possibly look at doing from within, but I will not commit to doing that until I get the exact details, but I'm sure if it's a situation where we need to address it to keep the road open for the residents of the Northwest Territories, we will have a serious look at doing it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Nundere Cassie member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, with that windbreak I'm talking about, it can't be more than a couple $1,000s we're talking about, but we're holding up goods that are coming into our region, and also not to mention all the extra hours to maintain that highway. You know, we're talking about 20 to 30 foot drifts here, you know, in that one specific area. So, you know, it's pretty easy that the cost of this windbreak is not more than what it takes to open that road, and not to mention all the goods that are waiting to go by. So will the minister ensure that this is done over the summer? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, we'll get all the information pertinent to this information that we need to make a decision on this, and if it clearly needs to be done and it's something we can finance within without going for an appropriation from our finance minister, we'll certainly look at doing that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral questions. Member for Tunade-Walladay.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have questions for the Minister of Health and Social Services on my member statement. I'd like to ask the Minister if there's been any instances where a senior or seniors, a senior couple, have had their homes retrofitted to a barrier-free state and are now embroiled in full home care for that unit. Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not off the top of my head aware of the specific retrofits that may have been conducted through programs available through organizations like the Housing Corp, but I'm happy to sit down with the minister responsible and figure that out and get back to the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, the Kitade Cassie member Tunade-Walladay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is, I guess, a question to the Minister of Health, because my assumption is that when home care is involved, even though the Housing Corporation may be responsible for retrofitting the unit, that would fall under Health and Social Services, but not 100% sure. But I'd like to ask the minister if he's aware if the Housing Corporation and his department have any plans to create barrier-free units out of home ownership units for seniors so they can age in place. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I've said before, and I'll say again, this government is committed to supporting aging in place. Following up on the member statement, I agree with much of what the member said as far as finding ways to keep our elders in their homes, in their communities for as long as possible. I don't agree with all of his conclusions as a result of long-term care, but we are committed to aging in place. With respect to the Housing Corp, they are working on a senior housing initiative that will help them actually make determination in this particular area. And when it comes to home care, every home care activity has to be based on a medical type referral. So in order to receive home care, you have to have some sort of referral. And that may include home care support workers or occupational therapists or others to help them keep seniors in their homes. So yes, the Housing Corp is working on that, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Council Member Tunade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm aware that home care can be applied in houses that are owned by the N.W.T. Housing Corporation referred to as seniors housing, but the main target group, as I see it, would be the homeowners. So I'd like to ask the minister if there's any plan to have budget, any actual money maybe would be a better way to ask us, any money actually put in place to allow seniors to age in place in their home, in their communities. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my understanding that the Housing Corp is actually working on that exact initiative to find ways to support homeowners who need to do retrofits to help individuals age in place. Related, through Health and Social Services, we can have occupational therapists when there's a referral come into people's homes and help them with other supports to help support activities of daily living. So identify the types of grab bars and other things that might be valuable, or alternatives to ramps and those types of things. So occupational therapy upon referral can go into communities to help make those assessments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Council Member Tunade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is really a initiative or a mandate that requires good timing. The mandate says taking action so that seniors can age in place. So according to the mandate that we set out 4 years ago, we should actually have seniors aging in place in their homes right now, but we don't. And we're just crossing the last budget. I'm asking if the money is going to be used from home care now in order to hire new staff so that we can expand home care, so we can allow seniors to age in place, so we can meet that mandate. It's an important mandate. I think the federal government knew that when they put $6 billion into home care when they were elected. So I'd like to ask the minister again, will there be new staff, new money put into the field of home care targeted at our mandate of aging in place? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thanks to the members early in this assembly, we actually put $1.5 million and some additional dollars as well into the creation of new home care positions throughout the Northwest Territories. We have struggled to fill all those positions, but those positions have been created. We're also moving forward with an initiative to support aging in place through family and paid community caregivers. We're getting ready to roll that pilot out as we speak. Should be out early in the new year. I also understand that we already have the Care Mobility Program in place, which is where homeowners can apply for money to make upgrades to their homes to help them age in place. We have the ability for our occupational therapist upon referral to go in and help individuals determine what kind of supports they might need in their homes to help them age in place. Mr. Speaker, we are committed to supporting those aging in place. We're currently in the middle of the home care review, which we anticipate will be completed on March 31st. That will help us make informed decisions on where additional resources need to go, but it'll also give us the ability to refocus the dollars we have into areas that are actually going to make direct impact. As I mentioned earlier, we have put in a number of home support positions as a result of the budget that the members supported. We are having some difficulty in some of our communities filling those positions, and I'm certainly willing to, and I'm going to be reaching out to leadership in those communities soon to figure out how we can work together to fill those positions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Trinidad-Willowdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to have the opportunity to just ask a couple more questions and a little bit of a change. I want to thank the Minister for the responses. I appreciate that. However, I'd like to ask about the caregiver program. When the Minister just mentioned the caregiver program could be a huge part of aging in place. I'd like to ask the Minister if there's been some sort of program developed for caregivers. Thank you.
Of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are moving forward with a pilot on that particular initiative, family and/or community caregivers. There's a number of different opportunities of how this might roll out in the future. We want to test a couple of those, so we are going to be moving forward with a number of initiatives in different communities to test that exact principle. From there, we'll be able to build a business case on whichever model seems to be the most effective, so that we can build a business case to roll out at a territorial level. But we're looking to go pilot in April 1. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following up on my colleagues' questions, I have a general question about home care funding as represented in yesterday's budget. The budget seems to indicate a significant decrease of more than $1 million in home care spending, and I'm wondering if the Minister can tell us how that relates to the answers he just gave to my colleague. Thank you.
Massey. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier in this Assembly we had a large amount of money put into home care. We used those money to create a number of positions. There was more money allocated than the positions that we'd identified. We had been trying to use those money for different programs. Unfortunately, there was $600,000 that was lapsing. Recognizing that we're going to be lapsing the $600,000 in this coming fiscal year, we had to make a decision on where we could get best bang for buck on those dollars, and it was decided to put them in for this fiscal year into Child and Family Services, which is an area where we're experiencing some significant difficulties. Having said that, Mr. Speaker, that is not the only pot of money that we have. We've been working very closely with the federal government, and we're anticipating making a number of significant announcements over the next couple of weeks on areas we're going to be investing in home care with federal support, which will offset some of those dollars that we're now focusing into Child and Family Services. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Nakira Cassie, member, Yellowknife Centre.
Massey, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the Minister's answer. What I heard him say is that there was more money than there were positions filled. If I have that right, could he tell us how specifically he's going to strengthen recruitment for home care? Massey.
Massey. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure that's exactly what I said. We created a large number of positions as a result of that budget, but not all those resources were specifically for positions. When it comes to recruitment, we've filled most of the positions, but in some of our communities we've gone out time and time again, and we haven't had any success. I've had conversations with a couple of the MLAs about the challenges that we're facing in the regions, and we will be reaching out to leadership here shortly to find out if there's any opportunity to work with them to identify people in the communities that can do these home support worker positions, so that we can provide training on the job to fill those. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Tadode Cassie, member, Yellowknife Centre.
Massey, Mr. Speaker, could the Minister tell us what the requirements are or qualifications are to work in home care? Thank you.
Massey. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it really depends on the job. Home care nurses must be registered nurses. We've also got home care LPNs. They must be LPNs. When it comes to home support workers, normally we need somebody who's got some skills in areas related to like resident care or other things. There is some training that is available in the Northwest Territories, but personally we believe that's a job where we could train on the job. We have the regional recruitment program that we're certainly willing to use to train people to do those jobs on the job without necessarily coming in with the skill set prior. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. No Dere Cassie member, Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my final question is, where the department has been unable to, or the authority has been unable to recruit the appropriate home care supports, then how is home care being delivered, or is it not being delivered at all? Merci.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, not everybody in every community obviously needs home care. It's based on a referral system. If we don't have a home support worker in the community who can do that, there are other opportunities to have things like individuals like CHRs provide the support that they can, other nurses provide the support they can, and other professionals that happen to be in the communities. It's not ideal. We've created these positions to provide a certain level of support. In some cases, they may not be receiving the full scope that's been requested under their medical direction, but we're trying to fill these positions, and we will continue to do so until we fill them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral questions. Oral questions. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to budget address, day 2 of 7. Reply to budget address, day 2 of 7. Petitions. Petitions. Reports to Standing Special Committee. Reports to Standing Special Committee. Report of Committee on Review of Bills. Report of Committee on Review of Bills. Tabling of documents. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to table the following document. It's a letter dated February 7th, 2019 from the Union of Northern Workers to the Minister of Finance regarding arbitration on N.W.T and Northwest Territories Power Corporation negotiations. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Tabling of documents. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table the following document, a letter from February 7th, 2019, addressed to the Premier and Cabinet from Samantha Morandin, Student Association President at Aurora College.
Merci. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading bills. Minister of Industry, Tourism, and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Monday, February 11th, 2019, I will move that Bill 34, Mineral Resource Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Notices of motion for first reading bills. Notices of motion for first reading bills. Motions. Motions. First reading bills. First reading bills. Second reading bills. Second reading bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole Bills and Other Matters. Minister Statement 131-18.3. Table Document 322-18(3) with Member Hay River North in the chair.
I will now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the Chair rise and report progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There is a motion to report progress. The motion is in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will rise and report progress.
May I have the report, Member Hay River North?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering Minister's Statement 131-18 and tabled document 322-18 and would like to report progress. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
Massey. Do I have a seconder? Member for Cam Lake. Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Massey. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Friday, February 8th, 2019, 10 a.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, return to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgments, oral questions, return to written questions, replies to the Commissioner's opening address, replies to the budget address, day 3 of 7, petitions, reports of standing and special committees, reports of committees on the review of bills, tabling of documents, notices of motion for the first reading of bills, motions, motion 31-18, bracket 3, first reading of bills, second reading of bills, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, minister's statement 131-18, bracket 3, and tabled document 322-18, bracket 3, report of committee of the whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day. And Mr. Speaker, I wish to remind members that the Standing Committee on Priority and Planning will be meeting at the rise of the House today.
Mr. Clerk. This House stands adjourned until Friday, February 8, 2019 at 10 a.m.